remember, in order to determine a gain or loss, you have to know what you paid for it. So start keeping better track of your basis. In this video, I want to address how to report a 1099-K transaction on a 1040. Now, at first you may say, well, what's the big deal? I just did a video on how to report 1099-K transactions as far as for personal and for errors on the return. What I want to do in this video is I want to look at all of the 1099-K transactions you might receive and how to report them. But more importantly, if you don't receive a 1099-K, you still should be reporting any transaction that you have a profit on. In that, I said, bought a couch for 20, sold it for 30 at the end of my college year in school. That's a reportable transaction. So they're estimating now that over $1 trillion is being reported through the person-to-person platforms like Marketplace, Venmo, PayPal, etc. So what I want to do also is that some states now, like Missouri here where I live, is now $1,200 threshold. The IRS just moved it to, for this year, we're going to stay at the old rule, and then they're going to move it to $5,000 and eventually phase it into the $600. But again, several states have already reduced it to $600. Stay tuned. So in this, the first one I'm going to look is an error. That's if you got a 1099-K. But after that, whenever I look at these other transactions down here, we're going to find, how do I report personal transactions? If you sell that couch and make $10 off of it, you're supposed to report it. Don't shoot the messenger. I'm just going to tell you how to report it. But then we have what happens if it's a hobby, what happens to trader business or investment. So what I've done here is I've summarized how to report any transaction that would come through a 1099-K. So let's go on ahead and do a deep dive in this, because you may say, well, I don't have to report this till next year. That law did not change. Again, I'll repeat, if you have a gain on an item, whether it's personal or hobby, you have to report it on the tax return. I'll show you where to report it. Trader businesses here that we can see here, the TOB is trader business. They already get a 1099-K, but they could get additional 1099-Ks from some of these platforms. And then it may be an investment. What I want to look at is if you get a 1099-K, how to report it. But when we get down to the personal, I'm going to point out there's a lot of transactions that should be reported on return that are not being reported. So let's take a look at this flowchart and start through. We got a 1099-K. Well, whether it's corrected or not corrected, as we show here, for what we're going to do today, we're going to assume that you can't get it corrected. The errors can't be corrected. So what we're going to do is we're going to move down and we're going to look at how to actually report it on the tax return. So with this is that you get your 1099-K, and we're going to go down and say, if it's an error, it's going to come over here. If it's not an error, it's going to go down and say, what kind of transaction is it? So let's zoom in. And in doing so, if it's an error, we're going to report it as I showed in the prior video, and you can see the video here on the screen to click back to watch. But the summary was, if it's an error, you report the transaction on Schedule 1 of the 1040 additional income, and then you offset it with adjustments to end up with what we see here as a net zero. I'm going to draw an arrow right there, then zoom back. So what we report here is only the errors, and it'll always offset. The income, the additional income, and the adjustment income will always be the same, and we'll end up with a net zero. So if you get an incorrect 1099-K this filing season, this is how you're going to report it. What I now want to focus on is the transaction is a personal transaction. So I'm focused right here, personal transaction. What does this say on the personal transaction? You're going to report it on the Form 8949 and Schedule D. And watch this, each transaction reported individually. Because on personal transactions, you cannot offset a loss with a gain. So if you have a gain, in my other video, I did the sale of 2 sets of tickets, one at a profit, one at a loss. We have to pay taxes on the gain on the one set of tickets, but we can't deduct the loss against that on the other set of tickets. This is very important. This right here is the biggest item to take away out of this chart. And that is, again, if it's personal items, you can't offset gains and losses. So each transaction has to be reported separately. If you don't get so here, if we don't get a 1099K, if we don't get one, then we don't have to report all the transactions. But we still have to, without the 1099K, we are still required by law to report all gains on personal items. I always mention about the auctions through the pandemic that Cynthia and I went to, and I would see people come back and they would buy a certain type of china, they would buy a certain type of doll. Well, they were going out and reselling those. If they were in a business, we're going to get over here and look at hobby or trade or business. But right now, they were just doing some of that and making some money. That is a personal transaction. If they made money on one of those dolls, or they made money on one of those pieces of glass, they report each transaction separately because it's personal. They're just doing it, or they're selling the living room furniture, or they're selling the kids' clothes that they outgrew. That's all personal. So I realize there's a lot of that people are not going to report. But again, when the IRS and Congress realizes that, there's an excess of $1 trillion being transacted on these private platforms with no tracking through a bank account, that's why they're trying to do this. Again, my main focus on today, because of the delay in the implementation of the $600 threshold, is we still need to pay attention to personal items, whether or not we got a 1099K. So let's go in and look back at it and then say, okay, what is our other transactions? Well, 1099Ks right now, businesses, trader businesses, TB here, they're already getting them and they're reporting them on their C, their E, or F, and there's no limit to their losses. They can put all their gains and losses together. Same thing with investments, same thing with hobby. But in hobby, you can't show a loss, but you can offset gains and losses, where personal you can't. Trader business, you just report them all together. And investments, you report them separately, but you're limited to a $3,000 loss. So it's time to kind of recap. I know I did this fairly quickly. Here it's on the screen. You can pause this and take a picture of this, because this is going to be in effect this year, next year. As this 1099K gets phased in, you already have a head start. And the takeaway here is that two things. One, actually three. If you get a 1099 error, I showed you how to report it. It just nets out to zero. Two is that if you get a 1099K, you have to break up each type of transaction to say, was it personal, or was it hobby, was it business? And then you go to this chart to see how reported. And three, even without the 1099K, I'm going to focus on the personal item. And during the pandemic, there was a lot of people that sold a lot of items online just because they wanted to get rid of something, they needed money, they started to develop their little niche, and I like this, maybe it grew into a hobby. But the important thing is, independent of the 1099K, if you sell a personal item at a gain, you have to report it. And a personal item that you have a loss cannot offset against a personal item as a gain. If you have a loss personally, if I go out and buy a brand new boat and go take it over to the lake, I don't own a boat, I take it over there and I don't like it and I decide to sell it at the end of the weekend, that's a personal loss. That's not business. That's not an investment. That's my pleasure. So the word personal means something I use personal. And if I sell it at a loss, I can't deduct it. And until you get a 1099K, you don't report it. You only report the gains. But once you get the 1099K, you need to tie out all the transactions, because if not, the IRS is going to send you what's called a CP 2000. It's an underreporter program, and you don't want to do that. And finally, with this delay in the 1099K, remember, in order to determine a gain or loss, you have to know what you paid for it. So start keeping better track of your basis. We need a takeaway, document. I'm glad for this delay because it gives time for people to understand what the filing requirements are. But even before then, this flowchart works today on doing your personal tax return in about a month and a half. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you got something out of it, and take a picture of this, do whatever you need, keep this, because as we approach the 600 and 0 transactions that is being phased in, you will need this flow chart even more.